this morning, a police officer this morning, in addition to 2 police officers last night, and there is reason to believe that 2 more victims trapped in the rubble will be successfully rescued this morning. So we're going to keep you updated on that. As you know, Miles, I know you saw the stories that one of these victims actually established cell phone contact with a family member last night. I can't imagine anything more chilling. When you look at this rubble, as we had all morning long, it seems an absolute miracle that anybody could survive the crush of 2 107-story towers unfolding on them.
Truly, the word miraculous is probably a bit overused. Normally it applies in this case. Let's move on just a little bit. The name Osama bin Laden has been used all this morning as we talk about the short list of potential suspects for this dramatic, well choreographed attack. The short list, really, he and his organization involving thousands at the top of it. And they are harbored, it is widely known, in Afghanistan by the Taliban. We are joined now live via video phone from Kabul, Afghanistan, by CNN's Nick Robertson. Nick?
Well, Miles, certainly a lot of attention focused on Afghanistan at this time because of Osama bin Laden. We have been told by diplomats here that senior Pakistani officials are at this moment meeting with senior Taliban government officials. Now, Pakistan is one of the only 3 countries to have recognized Taliban as the rightful rulers of Afghanistan, and Pakistan is regarded by many countries as perhaps one of those countries that has the greatest influence over the Taliban. We don't know the content of those meetings at this time. However, we can confirm that meetings between senior Pakistani and senior Taliban officials are going on at this time. It has been, however, in Kabul today and elsewhere in Afghanistan, a day of apprehension for many.
Fearing what might come next after the attacks on the United States, international aid groups began pulling out of Kabul by early morning. The German charity group Agro Action, one of the first to leave. United Nations operations here also virtually closing down as key staff leave, a procedure followed in the past for safety when regional tensions are high. Apprehension also in Afghanistan's Taliban leadership. Foreign Minister Wakil Ahmed Mutawakil quick to explain their position after the attacks in America.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has always expressed its condemnation of terrorism. Afghanistan has also been targeted with terrorism, and we have been victims of terrorism. We condemn it here and internationally. Terrorism is frightening and creates hatred.
With suspicion of responsibility falling on Osama bin Laden, Mutawakil's government, well aware the implications bin Laden's involvement would have for the Taliban, was keen to say bin Laden was not responsible.
So far, no one has officially accused us. If anyone has brought up his name, it is because his reputation of the past.
Overnight, the already tense atmosphere raised by an air raid on Kabul, illuminating the sky with rocket and anti-aircraft fire. An ammunition dump hit and 2 planes at Kabul airport destroyed in an attack by the Taliban foe, the Northern Alliance.
Well, for most people here, it really is life as normal. The departure of the aid workers will fuel fears about the future, but many Afghans here are impoverished after 20 years of war, and they have few other options really than to sit tight and just wait and see what happens, Miles.
CNN's Nick Robertson, exclusively live from Kabul, Afghanistan. Let's talk now about give you a quick recap. There were 4 airliners in all involved in this coordinated attack. 2 of them, of course, we've been telling you about just recently, plowed into the World Trade Center. A third, American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, was to fly from Dulles Airport to Los Angeles. Instead, struck the Pentagon. CNN's Bob Franken is in front of the Pentagon now with the latest from there. Bob.
And we have some further information on the search effort to try and find out just how many casualties there are, and of course also to see if it's entirely at all possible that there might be some survivors in the rubble of the crash, the plane that was hijackers crashed into the Pentagon. You can see that, of course, in back of me. What we have been told by Mike Tamilo, who is a battalion chief with the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Unit. That's the worldwide unit that has gone into so many disasters around the world and has searched for both the victims and the survivors of tragedies. He says that as early as yesterday during the day that the unit was able to take some of its search dogs and go through very gingerly some of the area. He said that they, quote, identified some bodies, close quote, by which he means that they did find some people who had been killed. He did not have a number. He did not say, however, they had been removed. We have been told that a temporary mortuary has been set up not far from here. We do not have any information from the Pentagon on any casualty numbers or even an estimate of them. There was one local fire chief who said it could be anywhere between 100 and 800 deaths as a result of this. Pentagon officials think that the upper figure is way too high. Now, he also said, he being the Fairfax County search and rescue person, that the search is resuming today. It stops overnight because it is so dark and so smoky inside that there is a concern that people are going to trip over the debris as they conduct their search. But the search is beginning inside now as they try and find out exactly the human tragedy of this catastrophe that has befallen the Pentagon. At the very same time, in other parts of the building, the Pentagon is open for business. It was important to the Defense Secretary, he said, to show that in spite of all this, that the operations here would continue. About half the building is considered safe enough to use, 17 miles of corridor, so about half of those are going to be in the safe area. That includes many of the vital operations that are conducted by the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the grim search goes on for the casualties of this disaster. Miles?
Bob, there are 20,000 workers who report to the Pentagon each day. I assume that not all of them have been asked to report to those areas that are considered safe. Is it just essential personnel?
Well, the word was spread through Washington media in the hours yesterday and overnight that people should call supervisors to find out if, in fact, they are among those who should go in. But, of course, many of them know what part of the Pentagon where they work, and, of course, some of the answers would make good sense. But the Pentagon is open for business. They're making a very important point with that, they believe, and it opened about 45 minutes ago.
CNN's Bob Franken at the Pentagon. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to London, where the markets there are taking a moment now to remember those victims of these attacks. A moment of silence. Let's listen. London markets ceasing business for a period of time to remember those killed and injured in those dramatic attacks. Paula?
Thanks so much, Miles. I think that'll be a scene repeated all over the world today. I know churches are talking about having moments of silence throughout the country, and no doubt Americans today will continue to feel the sting of this horrible tragedy that has confronted our country. Right now, I am joined by Dennis Ross, who is the former special envoy in the Middle East. He served in the Clinton administration. Welcome, sir. Good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you.
I wanted you to provide some context for us today. Yesterday, we saw some groups of Palestinians celebrating in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and declaring this as a victory against Israel. How widely held of a view is that among Palestinians?
I think today it's probably wider than many Palestinian officials would suggest that it is. I mean, you are dealing in a climate where there's a lot of anger among the Palestinians and a desire to hit back. But there's also a climate that has been created by their leadership. You cannot continually talk about the virtues of martyrdom. You cannot continually talk about the importance of struggle. And you cannot continually extol the virtues of the suicide bombers and talk about how the United States must also pay without there being a consequence in terms of attitudes. One of the things that is going to have to be done, not only with the Palestinians, but with many of the Arab regimes that are friendly to the United States, they cannot continue to use their media as a release for outrage and for anger, and therefore allow within those medias, which basically are not free except to spew certain hatred, They cannot use those media to create a climate of legitimacy for this kind of behavior, and that is what they have done.
How are you going to stop that from happening?
Well, one of the ways is if, in fact, these governments, especially in the Middle East, among our Arab friends, want us to be engaged in terms of pursuing diplomacy at an appropriate moment, there's also going to have to be an understanding that there's no free lunch here. They have responsibilities too. And one of the ways that they can carry out their responsibilities is to make it clear this behavior does not represent their cause, it discredits their cause, and in fact, if they want the world to identify with their interests, they're going to have to behave differently.
All right, but the bottom line is a lot of people think that U.S. policy in the Middle East makes us, or makes the United States, much more vulnerable to attack. Is that true?
Well, there's no question right now that there is anger that is obviously directed against us because of the frustration of what's going on in the conflict. But again, I'll tell you, if we had been able, as we were trying to do last year, to end the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians last year, the people who carried out this attack would have done it anyway. They don't believe in peace. They don't believe in Israel's existence. They reject everything that we represent. So one of the things that has to happen is these groups have to be completely discredited.
And do you have any level of optimism that will ever happen?
Well, I think we all have to transform our own thinking. Yesterday was a transforming event. We're going to have to create a new priority in terms of the war on terror. We're going to have to create a very different kind of coalition internationally that focuses on how, in fact, we all work together to discredit this, practically and psychologically. And I think also whatever it is we're going to do militarily has to take a long view about rooting out the real networks that exist. But I don't think one can simply sit back and say because the task is difficult, we can't take it on. We've now been confronted with something that is so dramatic, that is worse than any war we've confronted in terms of casualties in a single day. Our own thinking is going to have to change as well.
I know that Henry Kissinger stated yesterday that this is the time the United States is going to find out the true level of friendships with other nations. How critical is any role that Russia might play in this?
Well, I do believe the Russians have some capability when it comes to fighting terror, and also there is a history of some relations they have with some of the groups in the area. In the past, it would have been more profound because, in fact, they tended to support those groups. Now I think it's less profound. But in terms of creating a psychological atmosphere internationally, the more the Russians, the more the Europeans are seen as joining with us in terms of making it clear this behavior is not simply unacceptable, but it won't be tolerated. And those states that give a kind of safe haven are also not going to be tolerated. The more that happens, the more we'll be moving in the right direction.
Dennis, if you would be generous enough to stand by, I want to continue my conversation with you, but I want to remind our audience it was just about 24 hours ago, and we're going to replay some pictures here of the first hijacked commercial airliner that struck the North Tower here in New York City. Actually, this is the picture of the South Tower, which was the second attack that came 18 minutes later. Once again, this city just starting to come to grips with the impact of this double attack here yesterday. Dennis, Secretary of State Colin Powell was a guest on the air earlier this morning and bristled when I asked him about Senator Orrin Hatch's assessment that U.S. intelligence has now intercepted communications between bin Laden supporters actually discussing the attacks. Bristles may be too strong of a word, but I think he made it quite clear he is extremely uncomfortable that Senator Orrin Hatch is talking about any of this intelligence information. You understand that, I guess?
Yes, I do. Well, look, I think there are two dimensions to that. The first is we obviously have certain kinds of techniques and methods which we don't want compromised, because if they get compromised, then you lose the capacity to use those. And obviously, right now, what we're trying to do in the intelligence area is figure out exactly what happened, look back at what might have been indicators that were discounted because they weren't seen as plausible, and then pursue those leads. So anything that compromises the ability to find out what happened is obviously something that's not going to be in our interest, number one.
All right, but Dennis, do you have reason to believe these communications were actually intercepted, showing? I mean, we know that an Arab newspaper based in London, I think at least the editor had reported that these attacks were telegraphed as long as 3 weeks ago. Do you believe the intelligence information?
Look, my sense at this point is we don't really know. And the tendency is to leap to a conclusion because we all want to know in response to such a horrific set of events. I would just tell you from a historic standpoint, we were convinced early on that with Pan Am 103 it was groups based in Syria. Later on we found out that it wasn't. It may well be that the speculation about Osama bin Laden turns out to be right, but I think we really do have to be cautious at this point. The people who carried this out not only had great organization, they had people who could fly these planes. That's not something that is normally associated with the Osama bin Laden group. So I think one has to be somewhat cautious, and I think that Secretary Powell's reaction was entirely appropriate.
All right, Dennis Ross, thank you very much for all your insights this morning. We very much appreciate your joining us. Right now, we're going to turn our attention to London, and that's where we find Christiane Amanpour this morning. You're what, outside 10 Downing Street right now?
Yes, indeed, Paula. We're outside 10 Downing Street, the official residence and office of the British Prime Minister. Britain, the United States' closest ally in Europe. In the last couple of hours, the Prime Minister has done several things. He's had a 20-minute telephone conversation with President George W. Bush. He has had a press conference in which he was very forthright and very convincing towards the press about how he viewed what had happened in the United States yesterday. He's convened security meetings and he is convening a cabinet meeting. He's calling back Parliament to discuss this issue and raise a public debate as to what has happened and what measures can be taken to combat this kind of terrorism. He said that this is not just an attack on the United States, but one on the entire free world. He said that he and other presidents and prime ministers in Europe are in constant touch about how to, quote, stop this machinery of terror, how to eradicate and defeat what he called these terrorists. And this, it must be pointed out, was not just the single biggest act of terrorism against the United States, but in recorded memory, the single biggest act of terrorism anywhere in the world that anybody can remember. And to that effect, the Prime Minister said, and other analysts have said, to that effect, essentially everyone today is an American.
I want to make one thing very clear indeed. This was not an attack on America alone. This was an attack on the free and democratic world everywhere. And this is a responsibility that the free and democratic world have got to shoulder together with America. And at this time of tragedy in the United States of America that has consequences right across the world, and as I say, there will be British people that have lost their lives, this time of tragedy and this time of grief and anger and trial in America, it is important that Americans know that their allies and their friends around the world do stand shoulder to shoulder with them.
Now, the Prime Minister mentioned that he expected that there could be a great number of British casualties, since there are a lot of British people in the United States living there as residents and working there. He said to that effect, Britain's interests are effectively engaged in what he called this combat against terrorism. He called this an act of terrorism on a scale that was, quote, never before contemplated. While he would not be specific about what possible retaliation or action that could be taken against whoever becomes identified as responsible, he did insist that the leaders of Europe, in consultation with the United States, would take whatever measures necessary to make sure that this kind of terrorism was eradicated. Again, no specifics, but the Prime Minister very forceful. And then he would not be drawn on who he thought was actually responsible, but he did single out, without being prompted, the Muslim community in Britain, singling him out, saying that he was very gratified that they had come out and denounced this act of terrorism, like he said did the Muslim community of the United States. Again, when we specifically asked him, do you believe that this was Islamic terrorism, he did not answer. Again and again, he called this an attack on the civilized world, an attack not just on the United States, but on humanity and on democracy. When we asked him, do you believe that this is a declaration of war, and therefore are you, the civilized world, obligated to take action to combat this, again, he wouldn't be drawn. other than to say that they were in close consultation and that this act of terrorism and the machinery of terrorism and the finance and the support has to be stopped. Paula?
The Prime Minister, and in that short soundbite, forcefully talked about the collective need to fight this kind of terrorism. What kind of level of support can President Bush expect in Europe?
Well, certainly from Great Britain, I would say a great deal of support. Remember, the British have stood shoulder to shoulder, as the Prime Minister said, with the United States in various actions in the last 10 years alone, much less in history. They have been shoulder to shoulder during the Gulf War, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. This Prime Minister, Tony Blair, took a leading role in the action against Kosovo. This country has said over and over again that it stands together with its chief ally, the United States. And at the moment, what we're hearing from every capital of Europe is that they are together with the United States because this is an attack against, quote, all of us. We are all targets, they said. And Germany, for instance, offered unlimited support. This is in the words of German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and he stressed the word unlimited. All the capitals of Europe are holding emergency security convening meetings, cabinet meetings, security meetings. All are in touch with each other. There's a special meeting of the European Union. NATO's chiefs have been meeting as well. And this is really, as you can imagine, focused people's minds here. And it remains to be seen what exactly they do. Will they try to line up support in like-minded countries and in the Middle East, for instance, amongst allies and elsewhere around the world to make people, as they say, stand up on the side of civilization against what they call these barbaric acts of terrorism?
Christiane, earlier today I had a chance to peek at some of the headlines in the London newspapers on a very human level. What is the reaction of average British citizens to what the kind of wrath that we...
Well, on a very human level, I can tell you the reaction is one of shock, profound shock, and indeed fear. I've heard people talking about how this is just scary. People cannot imagine that something of this magnitude, of this organization, in a place like New York and Washington and other cities in the United States, that this could happen. And people really feel that if this can happen in the United States, well then it can happen anywhere. United States is meant to be Fortress America. This is not meant to happen in the United States of America, and it has profoundly shocked people. I talked to people, I was flying yesterday after this had happened. I talked to pilots and air crews and passengers on the planes, all of them absolutely stunned beyond words. There are no words that can really sum up exactly what has happened and what people are feeling. Here in England, talking to taxi drivers, people on the streets, people are using the analogy to Pearl Harbor. People are using words like barbaric. This is profoundly shocking. Every single newspaper here, even the normally sedate broadsheets here, have got blaring headlines: assault on America, doomsday America, one, the Times of London, war on America, you know, a tabloid. Is this the end of the world? I mean, this is...
All right, we apparently have lost our satellite to London, where Christiane Amanpour was just giving us the British reaction to the catastrophe that the United States witnessed yesterday. We will hope to bring her back a little bit later this morning. She also gave us some insights as to how the Prime Minister is dealing with this. He just very recently had a long conversation, 20-minute conversation with President Bush, as there is continued talk about what kind of collective effort needs to be made to fight this brand of terrorism. Let's catch up with Kira Phillips right now, that has some more thoughts on how the nation will continue to react to what happened in Pennsylvania yesterday, what happened at the Pentagon, and the twin attacks here in New York City. Kira?
Paula, thank you. Reaction is definitely the key word here. We're going to take you actually live to Logan Airport, and that is where two of the hijacked planes came from. We're going to turn it over to our Bill Delaney, who's live at the command center there. Bill, can you tell us what's happening right now within the center?
Well, thank you, Kira. Hundreds of federal, state, and local police, led by the FBI, now fanning out here in the Boston area to try to determine how these hijackers could have gotten on the two planes that left Boston yesterday morning and ended up crashing into the World Trade Center. The question, was there some kind of a terrorist cell here in Boston that enabled these hijackers to lay the groundwork for what they did. Now, a security expert I spoke to here this morning, Kira, said in many ways Boston is an ideal place for that sort of thing. It is a small city but a major city, and importantly, it's near an international border, Canada. Now, we know before the millennium, an Algerian was arrested on the Vermont border. This Algerian found to have ties to another Algerian who tried at that time to cross into Washington State for a terrorist action at the time of the millennium in Seattle. So we've seen that sort of thing here before. Also, we don't know if Arabs were involved in this, but if they were, there is a sizable Arab community here in Boston. It's a place one could obtain some anonymity, this security source said to me. Now, there are reports here, Kira, this morning of several suspects being looked at who may have been involved in this hijacking. The Boston Herald newspaper reporting 2 brothers may have been involved, both carrying United Arab Emirates passports, one of them a trained pilot. Also, importantly, Kira, a rented car taken from the central parking garage here at Logan Airport yesterday. Now, this rented car reportedly contained Arab language training manuals for flying a commercial aircraft. Now, the authorities focused on this car because a passenger who left here on a flight from Boston yesterday, when he arrived at his destination and found out about the terrorist actions, realized that he had had an altercation with several Arab men in the central parking garage. He called authorities, and they are looking at this vehicle. I should also mention that earlier this year, the FBI did determine that in the late 90s there were Arab men here, 2 with ties to the Osama bin Laden organization. They left suddenly in the late 90s, but one of them, a man named Bassam Kanj, had lived here for some 15 years working as a cab driver. He was subsequently killed in Lebanon in an attack on the Lebanese army, financed, security sources believe, by Osama bin Laden. The other Arab, Rail Hijazi, also was a cab driver here in Boston. He is in jail in Jordan for an involvement in a plan to blow up a hotel in Jordan that contained mostly American and Israeli tourists at the time of the millennium. So there have been traces of people tied to Osama bin Laden, if indeed Osama bin Laden was involved in this in the past here in Boston. And as I say, hundreds of federal, state, and local investigators now trying to sort out how hijackers got on those 2 planes here at Logan Airport yesterday.
Our Bill Delaney, thank you very much. Those are definitely riveting details. We'll continue to follow up with you at Logan Airport. Miles, we're going to take it back over to you at the desk.
All right, thank you very much, Kira. Live pictures from the Pentagon right now. Let's take a look at the scene that is unfolding as the effort there continues. Not a lot of hope this morning. Matter of fact, no hope of finding any survivors inside the wreckage there of the Army side of the Pentagon. 5-sided building, obviously, 5 stories. Some portions of it are opened, and some portion of the 20,000 workers who typically report there every day are at work there on what is, of course, not a normal day, but the routine will try to continue. There was immediately before we took this live image, there was a convoy of vehicles. There you see them. This is the tape image, which came down just a few moments ago. Convoy of vehicles there. We can presume they are part of the effort to continue the salvage efforts there at the Pentagon. We'll keep you posted as events unfold there. Back now to a live picture. Let's do a quick recap. It has now been 24 hours since the nightmare began and everything really changed. Today, we are revealing more evidence of just how horrific it all was. In New York this morning, a frantic search and rescue effort continues. Crews have found some survivors amid the rubble of what was the World Trade Center. We underscore that point. Leveled the World Trade Center. Authorities tell CNN at least 9 people have been found alive this morning, but the death toll from the terrorist attacks is expected to be staggering. All we know now is it will be in the thousands. The horror began to unfold 24 hours ago as a plane tore through the first of the World Trade Center towers. This picture came in overnight. It's a different angle on it. Ripped into the building, created a huge fireball. That was American Airlines Flight 11, a 767 with 81 passengers, 11 crew members. It was supposed to fly from Boston to Los Angeles, somewhere over the Adirondack Mountains. It took a sharp detour to the south. Now, 18 minutes later, a second jet slammed in to the other tower of the World Trade Center, both of them 110 stories high. This is United Flight 175. Also, point of origin was Boston, also intended destination of Los Angeles. Both of those aircraft heavily laden with fuel for the transcontinental flight, 56 passengers, 9 crew members on board that plane. We've had reports from cellular telephone conversations that were managed to be delivered from these planes that there were knife-wielding suspects who commandeered these aircraft and were at the controls of the aircraft at the time. Now, both World Trade Center towers, of course, eventually collapsed. Here, as we see right here, the second tower imploding. That was at about 10 o'clock Eastern time yesterday. Those the gleaming symbols of New York for more than 20 years now, symbol of our wealth, symbol of U.S. prosperity. All of it now reduced to rubble today, and there are 5 sub-floors there. And earlier in our reporting, Gary Tuckman was indicating there is some hope that there may be additional survivors deep beneath that rubble. An amazing Herculean effort underway right now to try to find people who might be alive in that pile of rubble, many thousands of tons. At the Pentagon this morning, firefighters poured more water on the smoldering building damaged by the suicide plane attack. That was American Airlines Flight 77, 757, Dulles to Los Angeles, its intended destination, 58 passengers, 6 crew members, 800 people killed in that particular attack. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says the Pentagon is in fact open for business today. We should say portions of the Pentagon, those deemed fit and those deemed safe for occupants. But the concern about that structural integrity will keep everybody out but the essential personnel, at least for today. Still no word on exactly how many people were injured total in that attack. We are getting ballpark estimates of, as we said, 800 people killed in that attack. The attack at the heart of the U.S. financial center is reverberating throughout world markets today. In Japan, the Nikkei average plunged below 10,000.